A fiscal cliff deal is done, but Americans wondering, why was it so hard to get there? Jerry Seib, he's in Washington with us. He writes the Capital Journal column, and he has been watching this deal to the final moment. Jerry, what did it come down to that final hour? Everybody's wondering, was this just sort of politics as usual, or were they really arguing the details until that last moment?
Well, look, it was hard because everything's hard in Washington right now. I think that's the backdrop of this. And I understand that most people, they look at this situation that it doesn't make any sense at all. Why does everything have to be so hard? Why does everything go to the very end? Well, I think there are a couple of structural reasons. One is just the basic polarization of Washington, and not just Washington, the country as well. You've got red states that are much more red and blue states that are much more blue than they used to be. And you have a situation right now in which the two parties are in a strange position vis-a-vis each other. They're very evenly divided in power across the country, but very far apart ideologically. And that makes Washington a very hard place to govern under any circumstances. And in this case, I think it was particularly hard because both sides knew that in this fiscal cliff deficit cutting deal, some important precedents were being set. If the Republicans agreed, as they did, to increase at least any tax rates, then they were changing the conversation from whether tax rates should be increased to which tax rates and how many should be increased. And that's a big precedent. And for the Democrats, they knew that if they gave in on entitlements, if President Obama said, as he did somewhere along the way, that he was willing to see benefits reduced for Social Security recipients over time, then they were setting a precedent too, in which they would be saying, yes, we can cut entitlement spending not just by reducing the cost of the programs, but by reducing what beneficiaries receive. And those are really important precedents.
Tensions flaring in the final days and hours leading up to this, Jerry, and there was, reportedly House Speaker John Boehner had some choice words for Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid outside the Oval Office. Can you shed some light on that for us?
Well, it appeared that the conversations were breaking down on all fronts, and that's another reason why this was, you'll pardon the expression, such a cliffhanger, because, the House basically couldn't resolve the debate within its own ranks about what to do here. That left it to the Senate, and so you had Harry Reid, the Democratic leader, and Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader, trying to get something going. Tensions between them got very high over the last 48 hours. That sort of broke down. The only reason, this came together at the end, it appears, was that Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader of the Senate, and Joe Biden, his former Senate colleague and the current vice president, obviously, and a Democrat, came together in a back channel and figured out how to put together a deal. So, the normal channels broke down. It's another sign of this dysfunction and the polarization in Washington. But it was the McConnell-Biden axis that saved this in the end.
And Jerry, when you see sort of that kind of heated language reportedly being used, is that par for the course, or do you think that that was unique for this particular negotiation?
Well, tensions were high, tempers were short, sleep was pretty scarce around here the last few years. I don't know where you were, but we were suffering down here. So, I think it's comparable to when a big business deal is coming together. There's a lot of tension. I don't think it's all that unusual, and I don't think your elected leaders in Washington are beyond using the occasional four-letter word. So, it's not normal, but it's not rare either, I guess I would say.
Do you think there were any missed opportunities for either party, Jerry?
Well, look, on the one hand, I kind of think this was the best deal that this Washington could muster right now. So on that level, I suppose it was the best either side could hope for. I think Democrats certainly think they lost some opportunities here. There certainly is a feeling in the Democratic Party that President Obama, by giving in on tax rates, in other words, he wanted to raise taxes for everybody making over $250,000 a year. In the end, he let that go up to $450,000 a year. I think a lot of Democrats think he gave away too much in doing that he had more leverage. He could have stuck to his guns. Harry Reid, for example, I think would have been happy to just go over the cliff to make the point that he didn't have to give in on a core principle, but he did. I think from the Republican point of view, there's a lot of unhappiness because people think, well, look, we gave in on taxes. We got nothing back in the way of spending cuts except a promise that next year, this year, 2013, we'll get back to that subject. So I think in the view of partisans on both sides, there were some missed opportunities.
Jerry, very quickly, any jockeying you saw in the votes in terms of implications for 2016 and possible runs for the presidential election? Then you see Paul Ryan, who was Mitt Romney's running mate. He voted yes on the bill. You saw Marco Rubio, another name being bannered about. He voted no. Can you shed a little light on that?
Well, I think you put your finger on a very interesting thing, and I think the calculations are already starting for 2016, much as most people probably don't even want to think about that. That's the reality here. And it is fascinating that you had two guys who are going to be in that 2016 conversation go, as you say, in opposite directions. I think Marco Rubio's point of view was, this doesn't do enough to reduce spending. I'm going to make a point here. I know it's going to pass the Senate anyway. His vote didn't really count in that sense, so he could make a political statement. I think Paul Ryan was in a different position. Paul Ryan was being watched very closely because people suspected he might try to undermine his leader in the House, John Boehner, who was supporting, in the end, voting for this deal, and it did, in fact, vote for it. I think Paul Ryan wanted to appear to his Republican compatriots in the House to still be a good soldier, not to have gotten too big for his britches, if you will. So he wanted to stay in line with his leader, and he did that. And I suspect what he can say, and I think what a lot of Republicans can say is, look, I voted for a deal that wasn't great, but it saved 98 or 99% of the Bush tax cuts from 2001, so that's a success. But I think their calculations, because one was in the Senate and one is in the House, were different.
All right, Jerry Seib, thanks to you and everyone in Washington for being good soldiers yourselves and seeing us through the coverage on the fiscal cliff over the holidays. Talk to you soon.
Sure. Okay.